Hello everyone, and welcome to my brand new series where I present not only a victory but also a defeat. And for this first game I have the white pieces and I start with the pawn to d4. My opponent plays knight to f6. And here I play c4. The idea behind the pawn to c4 is of course to counter black's d5 pawn so that I can then play knight to c3 and e4 and have this trio of pawns in the center. But my opponent immediately responds with the move to c5. Maybe you've already faced this move, where your opponent tries to exchange a flank pawn for your central pawn. If I take, I get pulled away from the center, and the c5 pawn is pretty easy for black to recover. They can play queen to a5 with a check and fork, but usually black prefers to play e6 to recapture the c5 pawn with their bishop, so that their bishop is well placed on the diagonal. They also have a knight developed, and after castling, they'll have a good development very quickly. So the main move here for white isn't the e5 advance, it's the d5 push, followed by knight to c3, e4, and maybe even e5 if the circumstances allow. But here my opponent is going to play the move b5, which is known as the Benko Gambit. It's a very aggressive opening, a highly dynamic defense for black. First, I'll show you the main line, and then I'll show you my preparation against this defense. The main line is to capture on b5. But black plays a6, and after the capture, the bishop recaptures, lining up with the bishop on f1. Knight to c3 is often played pawn to d6, then the e4 push, bishop takes bishop, which causes the white king to lose castling rights. g6, g3 to give the king a development square and complete the development on the king side. Bishop to g7, king to g2, short castle, knight to f3, knight to d7, and black has indeed given up a pawn. But the idea of the Benko Gambit is that black has opened the A and B files, where both rooks and the queen will be placed to create pressure, with the bishop on g7 lying in wait, ready to attack along the diagonal. The knights will often unbalance the position. For example, if I play pawn to e3, there could be a move like knight takes e4, and I wouldn't be able to recapture because of the alignment between the bishop and the rook. As for the knight on d7, it will often join the attack with the push to c4, then knight to c5, creating a double attack on the e4 pawn, and the c4 pawn will serve as an anchor point for the knight to jump into d3, attacking the bishop and the b2 pawn. This will allow the bishop to have more influence, and the rook and queen to exert pressure on the queen side. It's very hard for white to hold. It's a very dynamic and tactical position in favor of black. I've faced this Gambit Benko defense several times, and it often went badly for me, so I looked for a variation that would turn the situation around a bit. The variation I'm going to use in this game is a bit unusual for me. In my opening repertoire, I usually have a positional strategic style, but here, to face the Benko Gambit, I actually have a very dynamic, tactical, and tricky variation to try to catch black at their own game. That is, black is looking to set the board on fire and get dynamic, tactical positions in their favor. But I'm going to try to turn that situation around. So what do I play? I take on b5 as in the main line, but after a6 I don't take. I play knight to c3. This will support the e4 push and free up the bishop on f1. If black doesn't take on b5, then I'll play e4, and afterwards I'll take on a6. And when black recaptures with the bishop, I can exchange bishops without having my king's castling disrupted. So it's a slight improvement compared to the main line. And often, black will take on b5. They're hoping that I'll recapture and ultimately fall into their strategy of opening the A and B files and placing the bishop on the long, dark squared diagonal to create a tactical battery aimed at the queen side. But here, I don't recapture on b5, I play e4, actually threatening e5 to drive back the black knight. But black can also play b4 themselves, pushing back my knight and trying to win the e4 pawn. But that's where the preparation comes in. It's a trap. I play knight to b5, even though the knight has no retreat squares. I can't go to a3, nor to c3, nor to d4 because of the c5 and d4 pawns. So it seems a bit suicidal for the knight to go to b5. And above all, the e4 pawn is hanging. But taking the e4 pawn means falling into a trap immediately and losing the game quickly. My opponent didn't fall for this trap, but after knight takes e4, the idea is to play queen to e2, attack the black knight, and line up with the black king, because if the knight retreats, then we have a smothered mate. The knight comes to attack the king, and the e7 pawn is pinned on the file. So the idea is to give up the e-pawn to open the e-file and allow the queen to support this mating attack. If black defends with f5, we play f3. Either black leaves the knight there and loses it, which is the lesser evil for them. But if the knight retreats, knight to d6 will still be checkmate because the knight attacks the king and controls the only escape square. So we understand that black cannot take the pawn on e4. And that's why black plays the pawn to d6 here. Now they could take the pawn on e4 because after queen to e2, the knight could go back to f6 and knight takes d6 is not checkmate since the queen could capture. That's why I play bishop to f4 to support this capture on d6. So if black takes on e4, I can once again play queen to e2. Because if knight to f6, I have knight takes d6 check. If the queen takes, the bishop recaptures, and that loses the queen. And if the king comes out, there's a mating attack. With queen to d5 check, if knight to c6, we capture protected by the pawn, and that's checkmate right away. And if king to c7, there's a nice mate here that I'll let you try to find. You can pause the video if you haven't found it yet. So did you get it? It's knight to e8. Double check, and that leads to mate. There are no escape squares for the black king, so after that, it became bishop to f4. Black still can't take the e4 pawn because of queen to e2. So they play knight to d7. I play knight to f3 and prepare the e5 push to support the attack on d6 and try to open the e-file. That's when my opponent takes the e4 pawn. He's right, he can take it now because after queen to e2, he has the move f5 to solidify. Usually, after the move f5, you need to be able to play f3 to push back the knight and then follow up by capturing on d6. But here, I can't play f3 because of my own knight. But I have the move knight to g5 and I don't hesitate to play it. I'm betting everything on this threat of capturing on d6 because if the black knight takes, the knight takes d6 and we get the smothered mate again. So black doesn't take, they play knight to f6. That allows the bishop to be freed and gives the black knight a new outpost. And now, f3. And what will the black knight do? If the black knight takes the knight, then we return to the ideas of knight to d6 check, king to d7, queen to b5 check, king to c7. And as you saw earlier, knight to e8, double check with mate. So after f3, the black knight can't take the white knight, but black captures on d5 to counterattack the bishop on f4. And this is perhaps the most difficult move of the game. Because what should you play here? Of course, you can take the knight like this, you can take the knight like that, you can move the bishop. There are a lot of captures, a lot of possibilities. And here, I'm going to use a strategic line of reasoning in the service of combinatorial and tactical play. Let me explain. I'm simply going to retreat the bishop to g3. So after knight takes knight, there's still knight takes d6 with check. That doesn't change. But by retreating the bishop to g3, I allow black to take the bishop on g3, and then I could have played knight takes d6 because the queen could recapture. And also be careful because the knight would be attacking my queen. So after knight takes bishop, which is what happened in the game, I recapture with the pawn. And why do I say this is strategic? Because I just gave up my dark squared bishop for a knight. And so that has unbalanced the material situation. This is the first time in the game that there has been an exchange of minor pieces, an exchange that creates an imbalance because my opponent now has the pair of bishops. But the dark squared bishop is absolutely not in play. And here we're only talking about the light squares. Now, to play on the light squares, I have one more piece than he does because I have my two knights and my light squared bishop. Of course, I have the queen and two rooks just like he does, and I have three minor pieces capable of fighting on the light squares compared to only two for my opponent, the bishop on c8 and the knight on d5. And in his position, he has a lot of weaknesses on the light squares because his pawn structure here is mainly fixed on the dark squares with the pawn on g7. So in the end, what is actually defending the light squares? The h7 pawn and the f5 pawn. But the h7 pawn is attacked twice and will have to give way. It won't be able to stay on h7. It will either be captured or pushed forward, which will further weaken the light squares. You can see there's this open diagonal, the e6 square, the f7 square. There are a lot of weak light squares, and as I mentioned, I have an extra piece to play on the light squares. His dark squared bishop can't exert any influence, neither offensively nor defensively. So how should we play here? Because at this point, my opponent is about to crack. He's about to make a decisive mistake now. And you, if you have some time, I invite you to pause the video. What would you play if you had the black pieces? So let's try to understand what black could do if black plays h6 to avoid losing the pawn on h7. Because the threat, isn't even rook takes h7. The threat is knight takes h7, followed by knight to f6 check, and then capturing the black rook. If black plays h6, in any case, the h6 pawn is pinned. We could always take the rook if black takes the knight. Here, the best move would certainly be rook to d1. We attack the black knight, and if the black knight moves, it again threatens knight takes d6 check, since the rook will protect the pawn and the e7 pawn is pinned. And if black tries to defend the knight with bishop to b7, they give up control of the 6th square, the white square, which allows queen to e6. And now it's terrible, there's a double attack on the knight. There are threats of coming into f7. If the black knight moves, there are also threats of knight takes d6 coming back, with possible bishop to b5, and the play on the white squares is devastating in this position. So h6 is not satisfactory. The best move here is the push to e5, to deprive the white queen of the e6 square and allow the bishop to go wherever it wants and to free the queen, which is attacking the knight. In this case, we play knight takes h7, as I mentioned earlier, and black must play bishop to e6. Accept that there will be knight to f6 check, accept losing the exchange. But in this position, the computer says that black is slightly better. Sure, they're down the exchange, but they have an extra pawn, the pair of bishops, and a fairly compact position nonetheless with black. Meanwhile, white has a rook on h8, a rook on a1, a knight on b5, and a queen on e2. White's pieces are a bit more scattered, there's less synergy among their attacking forces, whereas black's play is more focused and solid. So my opponent should have played e5, even if that means losing the h7 pawn, and even if it results in losing material afterwards. But my opponent, you see, wanted to get rid of the knight on b5, which has been creating threats for a while now. He doesn't want to play bishop to a6 because of the threat of entering on e6. So he wants to attack the knight while keeping an eye on the e6 square by playing bishop to d7. But unfortunately for him, bishop to d7 blocks the black queen's defense of the d6 pawn, and we have knight takes d6, checkmate. And in the end, the threat he had been trying to parry since the opening finally triumphed in this position. After having seen the preparation against the England Gambit, I suggest we work on the theory of the English opening, because my opponent, who is not the same as in the first game, has the white pieces and starts with the move c4, which is the defining move of the English opening. The pawn on c4 comes to control the d5 square, so I respond in a fairly standard way by playing e5. Knight to c3 is played, then knight to f6 and g3. We understand the idea behind c4 because the c4 pawn will work together with the knight to control the d5 square and allow the bishop on g2 to be placed on the long white diagonal without me being able to hinder the play of this bishop along the long white diagonal. Nevertheless, I will play d5. Then pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, and bishop to g2. And here it's a critical moment because, faced with this double attack from the knight, how should one respond? If I take the knight on c3, white will recapture with the b pawn on c3 and strengthen their control of the center, because that will bring the b2 pawn closer to the center. And on top of that, it will open the b file for the rook, which can then work together with the bishop to attack the b7 pawn. So taking on c3 is not a good decision. I might want to defend with a6. But in that case, white will have the opportunity to play d4. Let me explain. In this opening, we've just created two semi-open files. The semi-open d file in my favor and the semi-open c file in favor of white. And if white plays knight f3 and I play knight c6 to defend, then short castling, for example, bishop e7, white is able to play d4 to attack my e5 pawn, break up my center, and open up the position to the benefit of their bishop, which will be very well placed on the long white diagonal. That's why the theoretical move here is not bishop e6. It's the second move. It's still possible though, but the main move is knight b6. It feels like we're wasting a tempo by moving this knight, but we're actually freeing the queen so she can help control the pawn on the d4 square, and thus prevent white from playing d4. When white plays knight f3, now knight c6, and we still see this control over the d4 square, which is what we call an outpost. But be patient, we'll come back to that. I'll soon give you the terminology for an outpost and help you understand what an outpost square is. My opponent castles kingside, bishop e7, b3, kingside castle, bishop b2, and now rook e8. And I'm going to explain it to you. How do you play on this semi-open d file? If my opponent plays e3, he will weaken the control over the d3 square. That's a square I could try to occupy with my queen, my knight, or my bishop. It's an interesting square. And even after e3, if white manages to play d4, the exchanges on d4 will result in white having an isolated pawn. Especially since after e3, you can also try to play bishop g4 to pin the knight on f3, which will hinder the d4 push. So what I'm telling you is that the move e3 will weaken the d3 square. If white plays e4, they will weaken both the d3 and d4 squares, plus they'll have a backward pawn on d2. So how will white play with their two central pawns here? Often white will play the pawn to d3. That's actually what's going to happen in the game. White will first play rook to c1, and then they'll play the pawn to d3. And when the pawn is on d3, my idea isn't to attack that pawn, since it's protected by the pawn on e2. When white plays d3, my idea is to get into d4. The problem is that when I go into d4, I lose the pawn on e5. So this rook moved to e8 prepares for the bishop to leave, so that the rook protects the pawn and the knight can come to d4. That way, if the white knight takes on d4, the pawn will recapture and the rook will already be well placed to attack the e2 pawn along the file. This is a typical maneuver to play on the d-file outpost. White has their own c-file and they're going to play rook to c1. I move the bishop back to f8. One might think that's a bit passive, might as well put the bishop somewhere else. But if I put the bishop on f6, for example, it will be exposed to moves like knight to e4, which comes to attack. But also, I was telling you about the d4 outpost for my knight. But the opponent also has a semi-open c-file and an outpost on c5 for their knight. That's why in this position, it's better to play bishop to f8. That way the bishop isn't exposed. And if white starts playing knight to e4 and knight to c5, as will happen in the game, the bishop can eliminate the knight and remove it from the outpost. So white plays the pawn to d3, and now I occupy the d4 outpost. The rook protects the pawn on e5, so the knight can't take it, even if my knight has moved away. And if the knight takes, the pawn can recapture, opening the file and attacking the e2 pawn. And on top of that, my pawn will attack his knight. My opponent anticipates the attack on e2 and plays rook to e1, and here I ask myself, how can I make progress? I know that you can always look to play bishop to g4, with the idea of creating a double capture on f3 to eventually force a pawn recapture. Because if white recaptures on f3 with the e2 pawn, the d3 pawn becomes a very fragile isolated pawn on the file. The problem is if I play bishop to g4 right away, my b7 pawn is left undefended. And then, after knight takes, pawn takes. I could get hit with a move like knight to b5, which creates a double attack on the d4 pawn and the c7 pawn. I could play c5, but then the bishop would be able to capture the pawn on b7. That's why, in this position, I can't play bishop to g4 right away. So I'll first play the pawn to c6 to block off that diagonal and hold the file. My opponent plays knight to e4, bishop to g4. Now, I have this threat of a double capture so that when the pawn recaptures, it weakens the d3 pawn. My opponent takes on d4, I recapture. And now my opponent steps out of the line of the bishop and plays queen to d2. I play queen to d7, supporting the bishop and connecting my rooks. White comes to c5 on the outpost, so the bishop on f8 is exchanged. Bishop takes, rook takes. And here, something important just happened. I just exchanged a dark squared bishop for a knight. That means I need to look to fight on the light squares because I no longer have a dark squared bishop, but on the other hand, I have an extra piece to fight on the light squares. And that's what I do by putting pressure on the pawn at e2. But my opponent, for his part, needs to look for play on the dark squares, and that's what he does by putting pressure on the pawn at d4. But I realize that this pawn on d4 could be attacked again, so I prefer to play rook to d8 to reinforce the defense of the d4 pawn. And that's when my opponent finds a brilliant move, a move that puts me in serious trouble, and I don't know how to respond. So you can pause the video now to try to find the right move for white. So did you find the move? It's the move a4. This advance of the a4 pawn is devastating. It threatens a5, driving away the knight so that the rook can take the c4 square and join the bishop in attacking the d4 pawn, targeting the dark squares. But advancing the pawn to a5, once the knight is driven away, will also allow white to play a6, breaking the b7 pawn, which is the foundation of protection for the c6 pawn, itself attacked by the bishop on g2. So this pawn advance is devastating. It will allow white to drive away the knight, then reach a6 to destroy my defensive pawn structure. And I can't find a way to respond. The way to respond is very hard to find. It's a computer line. There's no way I could have found it myself. I'll show it to you at the end of the game. But now let me show you what I actually played. I played a 6, at least to block the advance of the a pawn so it couldn't destroy this pawn chain. But after a5, my knight has to move, so I go to c8, still to keep protecting the d4 pawn. But here my opponent could simply play rook to c4, and I'm going to lose the d4 pawn. I can't save it. During the game, I told myself if he plays rook to c4, he'll miss this move. He won't play it. But I told myself if he plays rook to c4, I could play queen to e6 to try to counterattack the b3 pawn. For example, after rook takes d4, exchange the rooks and take on b3. And that's completely losing for me because my opponent could play on the dark squares queen to g5, threatening mate and taking advantage of the lack of protection on my g4 square. In short, I'm going to lose a piece here. That means with rook to c4, I'm going to have to lose my pawn. I can't try to hold on, and losing this pawn is very significant here, and it's clearly in white's favor. But maybe my opponent was just as blind as I was about rook to c4. He thought that queen to e6 was good for black, with the counterattack on the b3 pawn if the rook were to take the d4 pawn. And that's why white is going to play b4. But now this is going to give me an incredible chance to come and defend the d4 pawn. Knight to a7. Because now after rook to c4, we can play knight to b5. Bishop to e4 was played, knight to b5, queen to f4. Here I play f6. I'm trying to consolidate on the dark squares because I suspect that his dark squared bishop only dreams of one thing, being able to exert influence on that long diagonal. White plays bishop to f3. Here, I don't mind exchanging bishops since it will break my opponent's bishop pair, so bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. And now I'm happy. I start doubling my rooks on the file to put pressure on the e2 pawn. And I see that his play on the dark squares is hindered by the d4 pawn, which is very well defended by the presence of the knight on b5. He plays h4. I play rook to e8. He plays king to f1, and here I play rook to e5. I offer a rook exchange and open up access for the queen to the h3 square. Rook takes e5, rook takes e5, rook to c1, queen to h3 check to try to pull the king away from protecting the pawn on e2, king to g1, I come back to e6 to attack the pawn on e2, and now rook to c2. It's important to understand that in this position it's a 15-minute game, but there's no increment, no added time, and I'm in serious time trouble. And in this position, I'm going to miss the winning move. I have a chance here to take the advantage, a very significant advantage, and I'm not going to see it. I'm going to play too quickly and miss this move. So I'm going to invite you to look for it. What should black play? Did you find it? The right move here is to go to b3. We attack the rook, the bishop is under pressure, and the b4 pawn, and he's going to lose material. For example, after rook to d2, I can take the b4 pawn, still attacking the rook, the bishop is still targeted, and the pawn on a5, which will give me a whole bunch of connected passed pawns on the queen side. It's disastrous for white. But after the move rook to c2, which comes to protect e2, I don't see queen to b3, and I play rook to d5, consolidating my position. Rook to c4 is played, h6, king to g2, rook to d7, pawn to h5, I come back to d5 to try to put pressure on the h5 pawn, rook to c5, and here I exchange the rooks and play queen to e5, because I see that I'm going to win a pawn. e3 with the pin, of course, but queen takes c5, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, and my opponent plays queen to e4, and I run out of time in this position. So I have an extra pawn, but in reality the position is equal. It's a drawn game because my knight is under attack. Of course I can save it, for example by moving it to b5, but my king is too vulnerable. There are queen checks on e6, queen to e8, and sometimes even sacrifices on f6 that could happen. For example, after queen to e6 check, king to h7, white can very well play bishop takes f6. If I try to exchange queens, then white will trade queens, and by activating their bishop they will have regained their pawn. And if I take, well, queen to f7 check, and my king won't be able to avoid the perpetual check. For example, king to h8, queen takes f6 check, king to g8, queen to e6 check. And if I go to f8, it's actually dangerous for me because there could be queen takes h6 check, and then I have to deal with the passed h5 pawn. So in this position, if I had had more time, it probably could have been a draw, but my opponent was the first to get a winning position. That's when he played the move a4. Well, I told you it was a winning position. Not quite. I told you earlier that there was a computer variant that allows you to hold, but it's impossible for me to have it. So it wasn't a6, what I played was queen 6 immediately. But look how untraceable it is. We must accept a5, which chases the knight, knight d7, which attacks the rook, rook comes to c4, attacks the pawn. And here you have to play c5, accept the pair of pawns on b7, then knight e5, accept the pair of pawns on c5, queen e7 attacks both pieces to force rook to b5. Bishop d7 attacks the rook, which doesn't have many squares, and tries to entice the rook to come to d5. because if the rook comes to d5, it prevents the bishop from controlling the f3 square, and that allows you to play knight to f3 with a fork. And of course, if the knight is captured, the queen and the rook take revenge on the rook on a1. But you see, this variation is impossible to find. Even if you gave me an hour on the clock, I wouldn't even look for this variation, because you have to accept losing 2 pawns without even being sure you'll find a line with intermediate moves to misplace the white pieces. It's just too complicated to find. And so I'm bringing you back to this position at move a4, because that's where I used up a lot of time, where I spent a lot of time, put myself in a bad spot on the clock and couldn't stop the attack. I hope this video, with both a win and a loss, was interesting to you, and that it could be either instructive or entertaining. You can leave me likes, comments as usual, share the video and support the channel. And we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Goodbye everyone.